Hello friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we're going to be talking about the full moon that's coming up this weekend. It's actually coming up on Sunday afternoon around 2 p.m. on the West Coast. It would be 5 p.m. on the East Coast and later in Europe. And we want to talk about this full moon. It is kind of a dilly, or a doozy, as we say in technical parlance in astrology. So I can't wait to show you the the full moon, excuse me. The full moon chart is coming right up. I guess we'll just go to it now. So you should be able to see the chart, and of course we're looking at this in terms of a Aries rising chart with equal sign houses. So we just look at it in the natural setting. We don't know where you're located, so we don't know exactly what will be rising when the full moon hits in your area. So rather than look at the rising sign for the West Coast, which we do have displayed here, this little sign right here at 5 degrees of Cancer. So we will see aspects to the West Coast rising, but that would not apply really to the full moon itself. The full moon itself, I want to say this is really a dramatic and potent full moon. We do have sun.
Did you switch to the chart?
Excuse me, I'm sorry, we got a little distraction there.
Isn't showing it.
Oh, wait a minute, I did that wrong. No, I didn't switch. Sorry about that. Okay, no wonder you were wondering where the chart was. Here's the chart. And like I was saying, it is a chart that has the natural sign of Aries on the first cusp, and then here, down here, is the actual ascendant. In the time passages system, we use a little circle with a straight line across because the straight line across is where the ascendant shows up in the chart. Now, this is only for the West Coast. The rising will be different depending on where you are, so we'll look at it in terms of where the signs are, Aries, Taurus, all the way around, including the Sun in Libra. And this is kind of a relationship-oriented time. Libra is relationship orientation, ruled by Venus. And the Sun is still in Libra, and in fact, because we have the Sun opposite the Moon, it's even more relationship-oriented because there's those two elements opposed to each other, which signifies relationship. Just as Libra is opposed to Aries, the Sun opposed to the Moon does indicate relationship is just kind of the nature of the full moon phase. But not only that, this full moon, this is a very potent full moon, as I was saying. So this full moon is actually located, well, let's see. We don't have the right time on this. Let me put the right time in here. It's 2:08 p.m. I don't know how that happened. Didn't get in there. So you're getting to see how we can do things in the software. And now we have the full moon chart. This is the actual full moon chart for 2:08 p.m. And we do see that right across from each other now, the Sun at 20 degrees of Libra is opposed to the Moon at 20 degrees of Aries. What's so interesting about that? Well, here's Pluto at 20 degrees of Capricorn. So we have a very strong T-square between the Sun and Moon, which the thing is, that really emphasizes, and this, as you know, the new moon and the full moon are both signals for the following period of time. The new moon is a signal that, or a pattern that tells us about the entire 30-day period. This is the full moon section of that, which is the last half of it, and it's a very significant configuration, not just the way the planets are lining up anyway, but in this case sort of memorialized for the next 2 weeks, not like an eclipse which lasts a long time, but this is still a very significant moment in time. And I think you can see the intensity of things that are going on right now. We have Greta Thunberg addressing the UN and saying, look, we've got to do something about climate change. Your kids are dying here, are about to die. Species extinction, sea level rise, etc. We have the shenanigans in Washington with the impeachment coming down, and that's a big factor in American society. What's going to happen? Who knows? Nobody knows. And we have our individual lives as well. So the fact that transformation is really in the air, as I say, indicated by this very strong configuration of Sun and Moon across from each other square to Pluto, we can say some things about some other factors in this as well. Well, one thing is, of course, Jupiter is also at 20 degrees, so Jupiter is in a semi-sextile relationship to Pluto now too, emphasizing still further. So this is just a big Pluto time. It's also a big Uranus time, as it turns out. Pluto and Uranus, you wouldn't want to say they're square. There's a full 15 degrees that separates. The square position would be 5 degrees of Aquarius here. So there's a full 15 degrees that separates it. But Richard Tarnas, in his research, and his book is called Cosmos and Psyche, I recommend it heartily if you haven't had a chance to look it over. It's a terrific book. Really lays out what he considers a very strong basis for astrology as being something that's just mystically part of our situation. You know, we are ensouled in the midst of a universe which is also ensouled, even though we never realized it until recently, how completely everything is mystical and magical and connects to other dimensional factors of experience where the universe is guiding us. We're finding our way slowly through by sometimes the signals that the universe is able to send us. Richard Tarnas says that astrology is the universe talking back to us. So that's very interesting to contemplate, and it's talking back to us right now in terms of transformation. He felt that the Uranus and Pluto square, which is kind of weak now, but you see Uranus is retrograding and Pluto is direct, and so we are going to see them coming closer together, and it still will be in the rough time frame, and in the time frame of 2020. As we enter 2020, something like March, it will be within that 10-degree orb that he favors for these kind of what he calls world transits, where these outer planets, very powerful outer planets, are affecting an entire period of time. In this case, it would be this decade. So the period of time for the 60s with Uranus and Pluto was very characteristic, 1960 to 1972, just exactly the time frame that we saw that was so revolutionary. It was getting going, few people knew about it, then it was hitting its peak in the mid-60s, 65, 66, 67, and then began to fade a little bit, but still carried a strong mark right into the 70s, created the 70s as the counterculture decade that they were, and then the conservative empowerment that came back with the Pluto-Saturn conjunction at the beginning of the 80s. Well, now we are sitting with both of those because we do have, as we were in the 60s actually, Saturn was involved in the 60s as well, but we do have this opening square where Uranus, they were all back in Virgo, but both of them were back in Virgo, but Pluto moved to where it is now, and Uranus moved to an opening square in that relationship that they have with each other, and it will be a reflection of the 60s. It's a time right now of seeing what is the viability of those attitudes and issues of, can we transform society? Can we move from a purely materialistic society, which we were dealing with in the 50s, you see? Now we have kind of a mixed bag, and can we make heart and mind mixed together and compassion for our fellow man? Can that be something that we carry forward into the next decade of the 2020s? And that's the big question. And of course, as you probably know, because I've talked about it, a lot of astrologers have talked about it, as we come into this next decade, it's very important that the planet Eris, which is a very powerful planet, it's a feminine warrior energy, typified by Greta Thunberg, as a matter of fact, who has a very strong Eris, as you might suspect from the way she acts. You know, she's a feminine warrior, she's brave, she's speaking truth to power, she's ignoring what the conventional society might say of keep it down, just take it easy, you know, things move slowly, you know, wait for the process. She's not into any of that. She's trying to make it happen. And she does have a very strong Eris in her chart. Well, here we have Eris at 23 degrees of Aries being square to this Pluto position. And as Pluto moves a little bit back and forth, Pluto and Saturn will be conjunct in January of 2020, and then they move a little bit away from each other. Saturn goes past, but eventually Saturn will come and join Pluto at around 23 degrees of Capricorn. It will still be square to Eris, which moves so slowly, which will be in one part of its couple of degrees it moves back and forth. It will still be around 23. So there will be an exact square between Eris and Pluto, with Saturn joining, with also Jupiter coming along and joining. So this triple conjunction around the 20-degree mark, 23-degree mark of Capricorn, and it's mid-November 2020. So I bring all this up because I think it's vital that we see the process that we're in politically now culminating in that 2020 landmark election, which is the question of which direction this country will go. And I think it's going to be a violent time. It's going to be a strange time. It's going to be a passionate time. A lot of polarity going on here and elsewhere in the world. Now, the features of this full moon, before we get too far away from what's actually happening this weekend, do include both Mars and Venus. And I say that because Mars in Venus's sign of Libra is at 6 degrees. Venus in Mars's sign of Scorpio is at 6 degrees. So they have a semi-sextile aspect between them. Not only that, Venus is opposite to Uranus. Mars is making an angle to Uranus, 150-degree aspect. And there's a quintile as well between Venus and Pluto. So, I mean, this whole configuration is just really, it's bringing up the issue of relationships for sure, because Venus is prominent and opposite to Uranus. So one little recipe for this weekend and for this whole rest of the month is to think about how do we do relationships? How can we see relationships in a new light that we're currently in? Is there a way that we can find our way out of whatever conundrum we might be in to a new way of looking at things? Can we stay open to possibility? This is what's very important about Venus being opposite to Uranus in this full moon, just as Uranus and Pluto are also emphasized, which is the transformation of this decade, the personal transformation that we're all in the midst of, that we have to recognize one way or another. What do we need to do? What do we need to let go of? With Pluto, it's always about letting go. With the transformation that comes along, it's a death and rebirth process. We have to learn to let go of something, to embrace something else, which is in our best interest, which is in our evolutionary development. So we've talked about these things before, being a Uranus-Pluto decade as we're in. There's something else I'd like to bring into this equation as we talk about it today, and it does have to do with the new moon, which was in the earlier degrees, around 5 degrees actually, of Libra, and it was just opposite to Chiron at that time. So we do have a Chiron period in this 30-day period, and I think we're in the midst of quite a painful situation. I mean, we don't feel good about our country, in the United States at least, and maybe other parts of the world as well. We have a tremendous division going on between people trying to hold back from progressive change and people trying to go forward with progressive change. And how can we deal with the situation of the people around the world that are suffering? Can we help them or not help them? Or do we have to just every man for himself, which is one point of view? So there is a lot going on that's really painful in this situation in this 21st century. And in this regard, I just want to mention that I am reminded very much of the chart for what I call the chart for the millennium. Now, some people say the millennium began with 2001. I've always felt that 2000, which was definitely the time that everybody began to really think about, gee, we're not in the 1900s anymore. Now the decade begins with 2. You know, the century begins with well, the millennium begins with 2. So I would like to show you the chart for that, and I did prepare it for you. So here's a chart for January 1st, 2000, just at 12 a.m. Washington, D.C. is the place chosen. And we are looking at this chart in whole sign. So we're not looking at the actual rising of 6 degrees of Libra, which, by the way, I mean, I don't know that it means too much, but this is the degree of Mars right now in this full moon. But what I want to bring to your attention is, well, this was very dramatic at the time, and I commented on it at the time. We have a very strong Chiron presence in this millennium chart. If you look, it turns out that Chiron is connected to every outer planet. Chiron is partile conjunct Pluto in this chart. And that was very striking. You know, this conjunction doesn't come along very often. This is a 50-year cycle of Chiron in its orbit. And so it's actually more than 50 years when it catches up to Pluto again. Well, we also have, by George, where is Saturn at 10 degrees? So that makes an inconjunct aspect to the Chiron. And there's even an aspect, I think it's a septile aspect to Uranus. we can tell in the time passages software if we look. Oh, it's Neptune, I'm sorry. Neptune, if you look at the bottom of the screen there, you can see Neptune in septile within 2/10 of a degree with Chiron. So that's also another outer planet that's connected. And suppose we just look at only the Chiron aspects, which is single planet, as feature of the time passages software. I can just now look at Chiron connecting to all these things. And of course, it is kind of a little bit wider, but it is a sextile within 3 degrees between Uranus and Chiron. So all of the outer planets are connected to Chiron in this chart. Now, I don't want to go on and on about it, but when I saw that, I was struck by it, and I was saying, what is there about this millennium, this new dawning millennium of hope and optimism, you would think, that is also very, very painful? And if you look at the chart of the United States, that also has a factor. And let's look at that for a minute. So this is the October 13th, 2:04 p.m., 2:08 it should be, transits for Sunday. And you can see that this 20-degree mark of the sun and moon at opposite each other at 20 degrees of Libra and 20 degrees of Aries lines up completely with Chiron in the U.S. chart. And I think that's fascinating. So this is a very, it's a time of national pain, and isn't it true? I mean, we're seeing what may be termed criminal behavior in the part of the executive, Donald Trump, and we're seeing him called out for it, and we're seeing the defense of that, where he says it's a illegal or incorrect, some kind of incorrect investigation. He doesn't think he should be investigated for these things that he has done, like in trying to get trying to get Ukraine to influence. I don't want to go into all these details of the news, but you know the story. So there is a very strong polarity right now in this country, and I think it's a very painful time. And here's this full moon comes along right on the Chiron in the U.S. chart. By the way, quite interestingly, you can see that the position of Eris, which I've been talking about, is also triggered by this full moon, as I was mentioning earlier, that Eris is a big factor right now, standing up for yourself, making your voice heard, trying to make sense of it, and this is where I stand, this is where I have to come out on this. Well, at the time that Eris was actually at the 20-degree mark of Aries, was the invasion of Iraq. That was 9/11, and then following 9/11 in this country, which was also Saturn opposite Pluto, and now we have the conjunction coming, you see. At that time, that was a very painful situation also, because we could see we were invading another country, and that's kind of against international law. It was being done because of the threat of weapons of mass destruction, but that was shown to be a hoax on the part of the Republican administration that really just wanted an excuse to invade Iraq. So, and it was about oil. So these are very interesting things to recognize and to be upset about. It's a painful thing that the United States invaded another sovereign country in, I believe it was 2003, is that right? Anyway, that's what's happened in the past, and at that point Eris was right on the Chiron in the U.S. chart, and now this full moon is kind of illuminating that, and it's illuminating also the position of Eris. So going back to the natal, going back to the full moon chart, it's coming up on Sunday. We do have a strong Eris, it's square to Pluto. We do have the sun and moon opposite, making the T-square to Pluto. We do have Jupiter aspecting Pluto, and we do have a quintile aspect, which we can put the mouse on it and see, half a degree off. Well, that's a quintile with a midheaven. I'm sorry, there is a quintile to Venus as well. Let me see. Make sure what I'm talking about here. Oh, okay, well I thought that was a quintile between Venus. I guess it is a, oh, well, here we go. No, the quintile was to the actual midheaven on the west coast, so my mistake there. But we do have the opposition to Uranus between Venus and Uranus, and between Mars and Venus as well. But, the fact that Pluto is so emphasized is really powerful at this time, because we are all going through a transformation. We are all going through a time of trial where we have to see what's up. We have to stand up for ourselves, which is the message of Eris. And we have to go through it. It's just there's no way around it. We really just have to go through it. And it applies, obviously to our individual lives as well. So it's not just about what's happening in the greater uh, zeitgeist, the greater collective that surrounds us. It's also each individual is a microcosm of this major transformation of this decade, which we're still in the midst of, and which will reach a climax, I believe, in November of next year. And even January of next year is a really powerful time of Saturn and Pluto coming together. We can look at that, actually. We can advance this chart. We can do that just for a minute and see what comes up. So going a month at a time here. So here's January 11th, just to show you. We have Saturn and Pluto together at the 22 degree mark. Aries is moving so slowly, it moves a quarter of a degree every year when you look at each successive station. And so it's still hovering around the 23 degree mark, and so that's a pretty close square. So we do have this powerful configuration coming up in January, and that will be a time you can see the particular day that I happen to choose was January 11th, and the Sun also and Mercury lining up with this Saturn and Pluto, so that's pretty intense. So going back to where we were, and here's the full moon. So just gives you a feeling for the times that we are in the midst of and the times that we are heading for, and how you might prepare, how you might try to realize what you need to do, and not despair as well, because we see all these things tumbling around us and it feels like the whole world is falling down. And what can we do individually is just stick to our guns, find out what our bottom line is, and articulate that, and maybe even act upon it. Maybe go to a climate demonstration. Maybe do something that makes sense for you in your situation. There's always room for hope, and there's a lot of hope in the picture of this full moon as well, because remember, there is a sextile and a trine from the full moon to Jupiter. So Jupiter is prominent, as well as Pluto and Uranus being involved, both of them. And you know that Saturn is also involved right now because of this parallel that exists. I can right-click on Saturn. I see it's 22.5. The degrees of declination. I can right-click on Pluto. It's 22.4. So, this is still very close, the parallel between Pluto and Saturn, bringing Saturn right into this picture. So we're seeing structural transformation, which you would say, from Saturn and Pluto together. and we can just see that it's a very tough time, and it's a time when it's hard to have faith. It's hard not to almost want to just duck, stay in bed, hide your head in the sand. But it's not a time it's never a time that's a good idea. And so, what can you do is only you can look forward, you can figure out what makes sense to you, you can take a stand, you can articulate your viewpoint just in conversation with others, which helps. It helps to point the consciousness of the entire planet in the direction that it needs to be pointed right now, which is towards change, towards no more business as usual. It has to change, which is the message of the 60s as well, of course. And now it's amplified by the distance between and the feeling that we're hitting our last chance. Like the 60s was a wonderful idea. It wasn't mainstream. The ideas that came along for a better world, for a more compassionate connection between people, instead of this kind of materialistic stepping back from compassion. And now is maybe our last chance in this civilization to try to make a difference and try to come onto a different path. So that's what we're all about right now. So I wonder if there's any questions that we have. Nobody came in for a question right now. We didn't pre-announce. We will start to pre-announce and have a question and answer session that's live, but this time it's just kind of a bulletin. Here we are for the full moon. We do want to mention a little bit. Let me go back to the other view. And we do want to mention that we believe that astrology is a very helpful tool to navigate these times, and that we do have our major software, a flagship software called the Advanced Edition that has all the features to it, astrologically wise, and of course the interpretations are there for natal and transit, and you can get additional interpretations from us. But we do have that on sale at 25% off. Leslie wanted me to make sure to mention that. And she's here with me in the studio, of course, always handling things. We had a lot of technical difficulties this morning getting going, so it's kind of a joke between us that we managed to pull it off. All right, so I think that's it for now. Hope you have a good couple of weeks, and we'll be talking to you at the next major lunation. So, best of luck with everything. So long. Have a good couple of weeks.